I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Brent Olson, who is an associate professor of environmental studies here at Westminster. Before becoming a professor of environmental studies, Brent Olson worked as a canoe guide, a backpack guide, and a snowboard instructor. Now, he teaches courses focused on local impacts of global environmental issues and the political economy of natural resources, with a particular emphasis on the natural and cultural landscapes of the American West. To escape these often depressing issues, he also aims to ride his bike just as much as possible. Let's give a warm welcome to Brent.
Y'all gave such professional bios, I sort of feel like I missed the boat. Who's feeling a little depressed? Who's feeling a little scared? No, that's not true. Give me 4 minutes, and then I'm gonna turn the corner, I hope. I hope we're gonna turn the corner in 4 minutes. Here's where I wanna start. Hope demands clear eyes, honest assessment. Richard Lear begins his book, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation, by recounting the story of Chief Plentycoo, the last great chief of the Crow Nation. He told this story to Frank Lindeman after the Crow had been confined to the reservation, and Lindeman quotes Plentycoo like this: "I can think back before the extermination of the bison and tell you much more about war and horse stealing. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and we could not lift them back up again. After this, nothing happened." What do we do when our hearts fall to the ground? We know that our atmosphere is unlike any humans have ever known. What does that breakdown look like in our world? And today I'm going to talk about 4 characteristics of the climate crisis. First, that it represents change. Second and third and fourth, that it's unequal, nonlinear, and unexpected. First, the climate crisis represents change. The impacts are here, now, and we see them in global wildfires, receding glaciers, heat waves, tropical storms, drought, coral bleaching, insects and disease migration, and melting permafrost. And that's only some of the impacts. The 6th extinction, there are many more. And we're seeing these impacts in the non-human world. The impacts on people are also present in migration, conflict, health impacts, infrastructure delay, growth and disaster economics, famine, flooding, and again, the list could go on. A primary characteristic of the new climate is change. And we also know that this change is unequal. Different parts of the planet are warming faster than other parts. Any global average increase in climate temperature is likely to lead to a much higher temperature increase at the poles. And cities, and remember most people now live in cities, also heat faster than the global climate average. And if sea level rise is a critical risk associated with climate crisis, it's also important to note that some coasts will see more rise than others. And so again, any inequality of change isn't limited to just natural phenomena. And it's a truism in geographies of disaster that natural disasters don't clear away existing inequalities, creating blank slates, but rather, they exacerbate those inequalities and create new ones. And further, we know that those countries and regions that are most responsible for carbon emissions are also the least vulnerable. And the countries that are least responsible are the most vulnerable. The IPCC puts it succinctly: people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change, and also to some adaptation and mitigation responses. This heightened vulnerability is rarely due to a single cause. Rather, it's the product of intersecting social processes that result in inequalities in socioeconomic status and income, as well as in exposure. Such social processes include, for example, discrimination on the basis of gender, class, ethnicity, age, and disability. A third characteristic of the climate crisis is that it's at least partially nonlinear. The literatures on climate change are filled with discussions of feedback loops, tipping points, and nearly telekinetic connectivity. Like water that's solid at less than 30 degrees and liquid when it's warmer than that, the climate and the biophysical conditions associated with it seem to change slowly until they don't. The baselines we have used no longer apply. One new study has shown that by 2050, coastal floods that historically we could expect to see once every 100 years will happen annually. in some cities around the world, including Los Angeles. And finally, I want to be careful how I talk about this because I don't want to imply that scientists don't know what they're talking about. They do, and we should trust them. So please trust me when I say that I'm not indicting scientists when I say this next thing. But a fourth characteristic of climate change is that it's unexpected. Or rather, the climate crisis itself may not be unexpected any more than the laws of physics are surprising. But the shape of the crisis, its flavor, its manifestation is. Or sometimes we, and I'm using we advisedly here and throughout this talk, just pretend to be surprised because it's easier. We're actually quite good at fooling ourselves. Perhaps our capacity for willful surprise and for the willful ignorance upon which it depends is surpassed only by our capacity to change the planet. Or, in the words of Arundhati Roy, once you get used to not seeing something, then slowly, it's no longer possible to see it. But this is heartbreaking stuff. Seriously, it's heartbreaking stuff. And I promise to talk about hopeful futures. And so going back to Lear, he considers the possibility that Plenty-Coups' narrative was an act of bearing witness to an end. And I would argue also that it's an accusation. We need to bear witness to the climate crisis, to come to grips with the despair, frustration, hopelessness, guilt, and grief associated with living through it and preventing the worst of it. This isn't throwing our hands up in some sort of climate fatalism, but we do need to look at the problem squarely in its eyes. We're facing a profound change to our world. And so Lear asks, the question is, what would it be for Plenty-Coup to bear witness to a peculiar form of human vulnerability? If there's a genuine possibility of happenings breaking down, it is one in which we all live. We might then consider what it means for us to witness what seems like an end, and what we might salvage. How might we use those things that we have recovered to make our own unexpected nonlinear leap? We're just going to watch this because we need it. So what does parkour have to do with the climate crisis? I know you're asking. They represent change, nonlinear, unequal, and unexpected. Thanks. We're still watching it, sweet. So they represent change, nonlinear, unequal, and unexpected, like the climate crisis itself. Which brings me back to Lear's book. Lear writes that the creation of a new world, a world in which something happens, would require a new poet. He writes, "Here I mean a poet in the broadest sense of a creative maker of meaningful space. Traceurs, traceuses are these playful poets." And so play is a tool for building something new. It's about repurposing the world as it is into one that is more robust, just, and vivacious. Creating a hopeful future will certainly take new policies, new technologies, new economic systems, and we'll need to get all of those just right, and we'll need to get them all just right fast. But I ask myself, my family asks me, my friends ask me, my students ask me, what can we do? They don't write policy. Sure, you can organize or vote, but those officials seem so distant and out of touch. What can we do today, tomorrow? Part of my answer today is to play. But that's just one tool. I mean to say that we can use the tools at our disposal to make something. We might also consider fostering and salvaging tools like craft, like recovery, like recognition, grief, linguistics, fear, patience, anger, refuge, care, memory, the commons, kinship, curiosity. This certainly isn't an exhaustive list, but for me, it represents the beginning of a toolbox with which we might build a path through a diminished world, through which we might make the world anew with more justice, more life, and more care. These tools aren't substitutions for justice-oriented decarbonizing policies, but a means to achieve them. James Scott reminds us that most revolutions are not the work of revolutionary parties, but the precipitate of spontaneous and improvised action. That the great emancipatory gains for human freedom have not been the result of orderly institutional procedures, but of disorderly, unpredictable, spontaneous action, cracking open the social order from below. The tools I've listed and others have already started widening that crack, and we can pry it open further. And the results of opening it will be different in different places. They'll be nonlinear, and they'll be unexpected, like the climate crisis itself. So for me, in order to live in a hopeful future, to leap into a future that's not merely survivable, but just and vibrant, to glide into a world in which things happen, we need to build it by salvaging our tools. We need to make things. We need to make things happen.